Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty meaty today.
Yeah, we're going to tackle the Commerce Clause.
The Commerce Clause from the U.S. Constitution.
That's the one.
Now, I know, it doesn't exactly sound like a page-turner.
No, not the most thrilling title, perhaps.
But this is one of those things, once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere.
It's true. It's foundational, really, to so much of how our country operates.
We're talking the balance of power between the states and the federal government.
Exactly what Congress can regulate, what they can't.
And it all boils down to this one little clause.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, how much impact it's had.
Right. So we're going to break it down, go through the history, look at some key Supreme Court cases.
Because those cases, they're not just history. They still affect us today.
They set the precedents for how we live now.
Big time.
So buckle up, folks. We're going on a legal road trip.
Road trip. I like it.
First stop, 1824. Imagine, steamboats are like the Teslas of their day.
Brand new technology. Everyone wants one.
And that brings us to Gibbons v. Ogden.
Ah, yes. Gibbons v. Ogden. The OG Commerce Clause case.
It all started with the steamboat monopoly on the Hudson River, right?
Yep. You had Ogden. He had this license from New York State.
So he thought he had the exclusive right to run his steamboats there.
But then you have Gibbons with a federal license, saying he could operate on those same waters.
Ah, so we have a conflict. State law versus federal law.
Right to the Supreme Court they go to decide who has the ultimate authority.
Okay, drumroll please. Who won?
Gibbons.
Gibbons. So federal power wins the day.
For sure. And the court laid down a principle that's still hugely important.
Yeah.
Preemption.
Preemption. Is that like stopping something before it happens?
Sort of. In this context, it means that when a state law conflicts with a federal law, and we're talking about interstate commerce,
Okay.
the federal law wins. It preempts the state law.
So, like, if the federal government says no dumping toxic waste in rivers, a state can't pass a law saying it's okay to dump waste in their rivers.
That's a good example. The federal law sets the floor, so to speak. States can go above and beyond that, but they can't go below it.
Gotcha. So Gibbons v. Ogden really set the stage for how we think about federal power versus states' rights.
It was a major turning point, even though, back then they were mostly worried about steamboats.
I guess every era has its big tech battles, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so after this big win for federal power, what came next? Did the Supreme Court just become a rubber stamp for everything Congress wanted to do?
Well, not exactly. There were other cases that kind of reinforced this broad view of the Commerce Clause.
Okay, give me an example. Something a little more relatable than steamboats, maybe.
How about lottery tickets?
Lottery tickets. Okay, that I can get behind.
This is Champion v. Ames in 1903, sometimes called the lottery case.
Hit me with the details.
Congress had passed a law, basically banned the interstate transportation of lottery tickets.
Interesting. Trying to crack down on gambling, it seems?
Yeah. And Champion, this guy who sold lottery tickets, he argued that this was way beyond Congress's power.
He was saying, hey, Congress, you can't tell me what I can and can't ship across state lines.
That was his argument.
So was the court ready to put limits on Congress's power?
Nope. They upheld the ban. They said Congress could regulate anything that crosses state lines, even if the activity itself wasn't inherently commercial.
So even if the lottery tickets themselves weren't really the problem, the fact that they were being transported across state lines gave Congress the power to regulate them.
That's how the court saw it. It broadened their authority to regulate what could be bought and sold across state borders.
It's like they were saying, if it moves across state lines, we can regulate it, period.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there were other cases that followed this line of thinking, like Hippolyte Egg Co. v. U.S.
Eggs. What was the deal with the eggs?
Oh, this one involved contaminated eggs being shipped across state lines. Congress stepped in to regulate that.
Okay, I can see why they might want to regulate contaminated food. That seems like a pretty clear-cut case of protecting public health.
It was. And then there was Hoke v. U.S. in 1913.
What was that one about?
That case dealt with the Mann Act, a federal law that prohibited transporting women across state lines for, as they said back then, immoral purposes.
So they were trying to use the Commerce Clause to address prostitution. That seems like a pretty big stretch.
It was a different time, different social norms. But it shows how the Commerce Clause was being used to tackle social concerns that were seen as connected to interstate commerce.
So even in these early cases, we're already seeing this tension between a broad view of Congress's power and concerns about overreach.
Absolutely. And things were about to get even more complicated as the 20th century rolled on. The U.S. was going through some major changes around the turn of the century.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing.
Exactly. Suddenly you have these huge factories, powerful corporations.
Monopolies starting to pop up.
Exactly. And the courts had to figure out how this little clause about commerce
Right, from like the 1700s.
from the 1700s, yeah. How did that apply to this rapidly changing world? Good question.
So what happened? Did this new industrial landscape lead to any big showdowns over the Commerce Clause?
Oh, absolutely. One case that really signaled a shift was U.S. v. E.C. Nightcone in 1895.
Okay, 1895. What was going on in this case?
This was all about the sugar industry. The American Sugar Refining Company, they controlled a huge chunk of the market,
Ah, classic monopoly story.
right out of a textbook. And the government, they wanted to break it up.
Bust that trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the question was, did Congress even have the power to do that under the Commerce Clause?
So what did the court say? Could Congress take on the sugar giant?
Well, this is where things get interesting. The court, they drew a distinction
Okay.
between commerce and manufacturing.
Interesting. So what's the difference, legally speaking?
They said Congress could regulate the transportation of goods across state lines. That's commerce. But the actual process of making those goods, the manufacturing, that was a local activity, they said.
So Congress could regulate the sugar being shipped on trains, but not the factories where it was made. Seems a little arbitrary.
It was a fine line, for sure. And it raised all sorts of new questions.
Like what?
Well, think about the workers in those factories, their wages, their working conditions. Did Congress have any power to regulate that?
Even if the goods were ultimately being sold across state lines.
Exactly. It got really complicated.
Yeah, I can see that. So how did the court try to navigate these tricky issues?
Well, this is when we start to see something called the effects test emerge.
The effects test, what's that all about?
The basic idea was that even if an activity was purely local, happening within one state,
Okay.
Congress could still regulate it if it had a substantial effect on interstate commerce.
So even if something wasn't directly involved in buying or selling goods across state lines, Congress could step in if it could prove there was some kind of ripple effect on the national economy.
You got it. But applying this effects test, it was a lot harder than it sounds.
I bet. Give me an example.
Take the Shreveport rate cases in 1914. The court upheld Congress's regulation of railroad rates within Texas.
Within Texas.
Yeah.
So not even interstate.
Right. But they argued that those rates directly impacted interstate commerce, so they had the power.
Okay, so in that case, the effects test worked in Congress's favor, but I'm guessing it wasn't always so straightforward.
Oh, no. Just a few years later, you have Hammer v. Dagenhart in 1918, often called the child labor case.
Child labor, that's heavy stuff. What happened there?
Well, Congress had passed a law, banned the interstate shipment of goods that were produced by child labor.
Seems like a good law. Why would the court have a problem with that?
Well, they struck it down. They said, yeah, Congress can regulate the transportation of goods,
Right.
but they can't use that power to control the conditions under which those goods were produced.
Even if it involves something as awful as child labor.
They said child labor was a local issue, not a commerce issue.
So, even though those goods were destined for the national market, the court said Congress couldn't use the Commerce Clause to address child labor.
It was a really controversial decision. Showed how this tension between federal power and states' rights, it just kept going.
Wow. So where do we go from here? It seems like the court is really wrestling with the limits of the Commerce Clause.
And this debate was about to get even more heated as the country faced its biggest economic crisis yet.
The Great Depression.
Great Depression. It was a turning point for the Commerce Clause, no doubt about it. It's interesting how the court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause has kind of swung back and forth throughout history.
Yeah, like a pendulum.
Exactly. And by the late 20th century, that pendulum was swinging back towards a more limited view of federal power.
Okay, so what was the turning point? Was there a specific case that marked this shift?
The one that really shook things up was United States v. Lopez in 1995.
1995. All right. What was that case all about?
This one involved the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990.
Gun-Free School Zones Act. Okay, that sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it basically made it a federal crime to possess a gun near a school.
Makes sense, trying to keep schools safe.
Right. But the question was, could Congress even do that under the Commerce Clause?
I mean, I can see how guns and violence could have an economic impact, but it seems like a stretch to say that Congress can regulate guns in schools because of the Commerce Clause.
That's exactly what the court said. They struck down the law.
They did.
Yeah, it was a 5-4 decision. But they said it exceeded Congress's power under the Commerce Clause.
So, after decades of expanding federal power, the court was putting on the brakes.
Big time. And Lopez was a landmark case because it laid out 3 categories of activity that Congress could regulate under the Commerce Clause.
Okay, I'm all ears.
First, you have the channels of commerce, things like highways, waterways, the internet.
The actual routes that commerce travels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then you have the instrumentalities of commerce, the things that are used to transport goods.
Trucks, ships, airplanes, that sort of thing.
Yep. And finally, and this is the one that gets tricky, you have activities that substantially affect interstate commerce.
Okay, that last one seems pretty broad. How do you even define substantially affects?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's the category that has caused the most debate.
So Lopez drew a line in the sand, but it didn't completely settle the issue.
Nope, not at all. And just a few years later, the court had another chance to weigh in on this issue in United States v. Morrison.
Morrison. All right, fill me in.
This one involved the Violence Against Women Act, a federal law that allowed victims of gender-motivated violence to sue their attackers in federal court.
So a really important law aimed at protecting women.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But once again, the question was, could Congress do this under the Commerce Clause?
What was the argument there?
The government said that gender-motivated violence had a negative impact on interstate commerce. It prevented women from traveling freely, participating in the workforce.
Okay, I can see that logic.
But the court wasn't convinced. They struck down that part of the Violence Against Women Act.
They did. So even when it came to such a serious issue, the court was sticking to this stricter interpretation of the Commerce Clause.
They were. They basically said that even if violence against women had some economic impact, it wasn't enough to justify federal intervention.
It seems like they were sending a clear message. Don't try to use the Commerce Clause to fix every problem.
Yeah, there were definitely limits.
But I'm guessing there were still some cases where the court upheld congressional power under the Commerce Clause, right?
You're right, there were. One notable example is Gonzales v. Raich in 2005.
Raich. Okay, that one rings a bell. Wasn't that the medical marijuana case?
That's the one.
What was the Commerce Clause issue there?
Well, California had legalized medical marijuana, but it was still illegal under federal law.
Right.
So the question was, could Congress ban marijuana, even for medical use, in a state where it was legal?
It sounds like a classic states' rights issue.
It did, but the court sided with the federal government in this case.
They did. Wow, that's surprising.
Yeah, they said that even though the marijuana in question was being grown and used locally in California, it could still potentially affect the national marijuana market.
So they were using that substantial effects argument again.
Exactly. And the court said that was enough to justify federal regulation.
So even in this era of limits on the Commerce Clause, the court was still willing to allow Congress to regulate activities that had even a potential impact on the national market.
Yep, it's all about finding that balance.
Right, that balance between federal power and states' rights.
And that brings us to one of the most significant Commerce Clause cases in recent history, NFIB v. Sebelius.
Yes, NFIB v. Sebelius, the Obamacare case.
The big one. This case really put the Commerce Clause to the test.
So refresh my memory, what was the specific issue related to the Commerce Clause in the Obamacare case?
Well, the Affordable Care Act, it had this thing called the individual mandate, which basically required most Americans to buy health insurance or pay a penalty.
Right, I remember that.
The government argued that this was necessary to make the entire healthcare system work, to make sure everyone had coverage.
And they were saying that Congress had the power to do this under the Commerce Clause.
That's right. They said that by requiring people to buy health insurance, Congress was essentially regulating the market for health care, which is obviously a huge part of interstate commerce.
It does seem like a pretty direct connection there.
It does.
Huh?
But in a 5-4 decision, the court said no.
They did. So they struck down the individual mandate.
They did, but there's a twist.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The court upheld the individual mandate, but they did it under Congress's power to tax.
Wait, what? How does that work?
They basically said that the penalty for not having insurance was essentially a tax.
Ah.
And Congress definitely has the power to tax.
So the Affordable Care Act survived, but it went through a bit of a legal roller coaster ride.
It did.
So what does all of this tell us about the Commerce Clause? It seems like the court has gone back and forth, sometimes giving Congress broad power, sometimes reining them in.
It's definitely been a long and winding road.
And I imagine this debate will continue as we face new challenges in the 21st century.
Absolutely. The world is constantly changing, and the Commerce Clause is going to keep evolving along with it.
It's a reminder that the Constitution is a living document.
It's not just some old dusty parchment.
It's a framework for navigating the complexities of our modern world. And the Commerce Clause is right at the heart of that framework.
It's one of the most powerful tools we have for shaping the balance of power in our society.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the Commerce Clause and why it matters so much.
It's a fascinating area of law, that's for sure.
It is. And if you want to learn more, we'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
Yeah, there's a ton of great information out there.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and stay curious.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Commerce Clause.